Today's lecture is going to be on some of the changes that occur in cognitive abilities during this period of midlife. We've already talked about cognitive changes that occur during childhood. We talked about Piaget then and other abilities that kind of come online during childhood. We talked about cognitive changes that occur during adolescence, and so this is just our next stepping stone. We're going to talk a lot about decline, but you'll see how not everything is in decline, at least not necessarily right at midlife. So in general, there's this widely held belief that IQ or intelligence declines in middle to late adulthood and late adulthood, and it's happening because the brain is deteriorating. And we're going to unpack that a little bit, both to unpack intelligence as different forms of intelligence or different forms of capabilities, and also looking at the brain and what kinds of changes have been researched and found. I want to make sure that you're aware that when we're studying changes in intelligence, this is kind of complex. It's complex because of a lot of factors that change over time independent of intelligence. So first, you may have heard this term, the Flynn effect, before. It is something that's even covered in Intro to Psych commonly, but it's this idea that when we look at data from generations past on intelligence and compare it to those same tests today. So if we had a sample of 50-year-olds from 40 years ago and look at those different 50-year-olds, but today, that we're probably going to see an increase in IQ scores. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the people who are in their 50s are smarter today? It's complicated. So this Flynn effect is widely established in psychology. What this past research and what this is not really accounting for is cohort effects. So each generation, we can break it down by even decades, is a cohort. So it's a group of people. But each new generation experiences better lots of things as a whole. I mean, better health, maybe better medical care. We could talk about in some ways about health is decline. I mean, there's more heart disease, more obesity, but when we look at health overall, it's better. We have better education, which is informing us on how to be healthier. But it's also making it that we're more likely to be in charge of our own decision making and get in line with current health promotions. We have better nutrition, or in most people. Obviously, there are individual differences having to do with poverty and nutrition, but as a whole, different standards of living. We have less exposure to illnesses or infectious diseases. I know that doesn't seem right now with a pandemic going on, but when we look at it, from 100 years ago, we're going to see big differences. So essentially what's going on here is that when we're looking at intelligence and how it changes over time, we can't say age alone is accounting for changes in intelligence. So does intelligence decline? Does intelligence, increase? Depends on the type of intelligence, but it's not just age alone. It's so complicated. We can't go back in time and give the people who are now in their 60s when they were in their 20s these different opportunities. And so again, it's a complicated study or a complicated topic to study. Before I get into the details of this particular slide, I want to make sure we're also on the same page regarding different types of intelligence. So the textbook talks about this to some extent, and you may have learned about this in other courses, including an Intro to Psych course. But when we're talking about like crystallized intelligence, these tend to be skills that depend on accumulated knowledge and experience, has to do with good judgment, kind of mastery of social convention and norms. So like what's widely accepted. This includes a lot of verbal skills. When we talk about fluid intelligence, this is more of this basic information processing type of skills. So things like working memory and processing speed. We're going to be talking more about fluid intelligence in today's lecture because we're going to be talking about changes that occur to memory, processing speed, and attention. When we look at how these change over time, crystallized intelligence, by and large, increases through middle adulthood, whereas fluid intelligence tends to start even declining in one's 20s, although that's the broad research finding. So, getting into this data a little bit more, there is a famous longitudinal study called the Seattle Longitudinal Study, and this began in 1956. It's considered to be one of the most extensive psychological research studies of how adults develop and change through adulthood. And it's a unique kind of cohort longitudinal study. So, looking at multiple birth cohorts, so again, groups of people over the same age span. This study, I think, included around 6,000 adults, so it's a big group of individuals. Now, what some of the, I mean, there are multiple findings that have emerged from this particular study, but some of the findings are quite interesting. There are some abilities that seem to more like be more I don't know, even stronger during midlife. So things like verbal ability, so our ability to put things into words and related to that verbal memory, so thinking of the right words. You could think about people who are doing crossword puzzles potentially, being very good at that during midlife compared to other ages. Inductive reasoning is also peaking. So inductive reasoning is just using evidence to reach a conclusion, so kind of building up an argument. And some of our numeric abilities are really doing well in midlife. And lastly, spatial orientation. So spatial orientation is our ability to understand um, how how things are moved in space. I think the best example is if you've ever had to move a couch into a small hallway, or let's say to move a couch up a set of stairs and into a bedroom and through a doorway. And it's like, how do you have to move it around in order for it to fit? There are some gender differences here. As a whole, males tend to be better at spatial orientation, but you see that there's also some age differences. Here's an example of a spatial orientation problem. So you see the original kind of set of blocks, and then there's A, B, C, and D asking which of the two force shapes match the original. So there's two correct answers. I'll give you a second just to look at it. I'm not sure I gave you enough time, but the answers are, I believe, A and C. So people who are good at spatial orientation are able to do this more quickly than somebody who is less good at spatial orientation. So again, there are gender differences, but there also are important age differences. So it certainly isn't the case that every single aspect of cognitive ability is declining during midlife. There are aspects of our cognitive skills that are actually peaking. There's been a lot of effort to understand, though, why we do see declines in cognitive abilities in midlife, or even starting at one's 20s, depending on, what area of cognitive ability we're talking about. So some of the both theoretical findings or theoretical musings and empirical findings suggest that it's a combination of different things that are happening mostly in the brain. Although we're going to talk in just a second about how lifestyle changes in the environment are going to affect those cognitive changes that are occurring in the brain. So broadly, some of the research has suggested that there's just a slowing of the central nervous system. So everything in the brain broadly is kind of just slowing down. We'll talk more about that as we get into specific examples with processing speed and attention, for example. Also, declines in frontal lobe functioning. So the frontal lobe is associated for many areas of executive functioning. So things like processing speed, working memory, which you also see as a point on this slide right here, our ability to plan, our ability to just work through problems, decision making. So the frontal lobe, and then more specifically the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for a lot of these skills that are very cognitive, very needed in solving problems. And so if that area of the brain isn't functioning at its peak level, then the cognitive skills are going to suffer. You can think back to adolescence, and we had the same kind of issue going on. If the prefrontal cortex wasn't fully developed in adolescence, we questioned whether or not adolescents were able to make the best decisions. And we were talking about the different kinds of skills that kind of turn on in adolescence or get better in adolescence, like the ability to plan and to think about the future in different ways. And so now we're going in the other direction. Again, if the prefrontal cortex isn't working to its optimal level, we're losing those same skills. The third point there, reductions in neural interconnectivity, is this idea of, how well are the neurons speaking to one another? And we're going to talk about this in relation to processing speed in just a moment. But what does it mean if the same neurons that once talked to one another aren't able to do so anymore? How does it affect us? So these are just some of the proposed reasons and studied reasons for why we see declines in the cognitive system. But we also see that there are individual differences. It's not the case that every single individual is going through the same changes to the same degrees. And this is, independent of disease and other things like that, which we're going to talk about. But some of the research has suggested that individuals who have above average education levels are less likely to see some of these cognitive declines, and that's probably due to working that muscle, using the brain, and perhaps if they are in occupations or engage in activities that are stimulating the brain. Going back to one of the first principles that we talked about in class, and we were talking about infants, is this idea of use it or lose it. It's not the case that you can completely stop any of these changes from happening, but the fact of the matter is that with practice and when we need to use these skills, we keep them up to the best of our ability. So individuals who have self-directed occupations, this means that they are making decisions, right? It's not just like this mundane job in and out every day, but they have to be thinking about these topics and using these processing skills and remembering things because it's important for their job. You may have heard of things of the idea that people who use or do crossword puzzles are actually stimulating their brain, so keeping that muscle working. There's also been some interesting research about personalities and kind of going with the flow. I'm not exactly sure the mechanism for why that would be the case, for why their cognitive abilities aren't declining. I do know that there's research on optimism and how people who are optimistic are more likely to be healthier. And there's actually biological reasons for that, and one of them is lower stress levels and just a better stress response. There's lots of research on the positive benefits of having really great relationships in terms of all sorts of different outcomes, but including health outcomes and here cognitive outcomes. Obviously, disease. We're going to talk about dementia and Alzheimer's more specifically when we get to old age, but these are two different, forms of disease that are going to affect one's ability to cognitively function as they once did. And then individuals who are economically well off, this is going to be associated with a lot of these other factors, perhaps above average education, more stimulating leisure activities, for example, and absence of disease. So those are all kind of related. But this just goes to show you that one, intelligence and these cognitive abilities are complex, but two, that even though we are going to see some kind of declines because of just biology, environment also plays a role. We can't disentangle biological effects from environmental effects in almost any construct in developmental psychology, but including intelligence and including cognitive abilities.